One of the greatest victories Saturn fans would have during the 32-bit era was the console's robust and well-received support from Capcom. Its stable of two-dimensional fighting games felt right at home on Sega's machine. The Sony PlayStation did a decent job in this regard, but the Saturn would go the extra mile thanks to its support of the RAM expansion cartridges. This allowed better animations, faster load times, and an overall closer arcade experience. We first saw its use with the 1MB RAM expansion in games like Cyberbots. It was so cool to see the extra animations fire off in what was essentially the arcade at home in all its glory. Then Capcom started releasing its fighting games for the 4MB extended RAM cartridge, a massive upgrade that allowed ports like X-Men vs. Street Fighter to shine on the Saturn in a way no other console could compete with. This wasn't just about animation anymore, as the PlayStation version lost important features like the tag team gameplay completely. While Saturn was having a rough time in the West, import fans took solace in these games as the best available. Shortly after the release of X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Capcom updated the series with Marvel's Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, another tag team-based affair that supported the 4MB RAM cartridge. But was this a large enough upgrade over the previous game to justify another $70 investment, especially after just 11 months between the two? In this episode, we will be taking a look at Marvel's Superheroes vs. Street Fighter and answer that very question. The story in this one follows the supervillain Apocalypse and his conflict with Capcom and Marvel's finest. This big baddie wants to kill off everyone he deems too weak and force humanity to evolve into a stronger, more resilient life form. As I mentioned earlier, this was released just 11 months after X-Men vs. Street Fighter in October of 1998. It was meant as not just a simple roster update, but a rebalancing to fix some of the outstanding issues with the previous game, like infinite combos and low-tier characters. Otherwise, the core experience is nearly identical to X-Men vs. Street Fighter, right down to the tag team gameplay and the screen-filling super combos. One new feature was the addition of the variable assist, a gameplay element that allowed you to call your off-screen partner to quickly attack before retreating again. This move can be used to start combos, stop an advancing enemy, or in some cases, used as a projectile for a fighter that otherwise lacks one. This doesn't come without risk because you can still take damage during this time. The roster also has undergone a major shakeup. Since this game expands to the larger Marvel Superheroes list, almost all of the original X-Men have been replaced, save for Cyclops and Wolverine. Now you get access to Captain America, Blackheart, the Hulk, Omega Red, Shuma Gorath, and Spider-Man. The Street Fighter side remains largely unchanged, though we do trade Cammy and Charlie for Dan and Sakura. Of course, we also get a list of hidden fighters you can run. These are mainly palette swaps of existing fighters with different attributes. You can choose Armor Spider-Man, Mephisto, US Agent, Dark Sakura, Mech Zangief, and Shadow. Shadow is the only fighter not from the main roster and is actually a version of Charlie. There is also a character called Norimaru that is added for comedic effect. This guy appears as a nerdy, glasses-wearing buffoon, but he still has the moves, combos, and supers to compete with the big dogs. That's no joke. A really solid Norimaru user can wreck the game easily. Our final new character is Met Goki, otherwise known as Cyber Akuma. This is one of the two final bosses of the game. He is faster and more aggressive than his typical form and has a number of new moves. As far as gameplay modes, you get the expected arcade mode that plays out the story, a versus mode for multiplayer, and a survival mode that pits you against every fighter without the ability to continue. At its initial release, Marvel's Superheroes vs. Street Fighter was available both with and without the 4MB extended RAM cartridge. Visually, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter is just as impressive as X-Men vs. Street Fighter. You get the same level of outstanding animation, huge colorful sprites, detailed backgrounds, and all the speed you can handle. Having this at home intact was such a pleasure, and it's one of those games that stands the test of time incredibly well. In fact, I dare say these graphics are timeless examples of the lasting appeal of well-done two-dimensional visuals. There are some people out there that complain it wasn't different enough from X-Men vs. Street Fighter to justify a separate release, and I must admit the backgrounds could have used some more variety. Most of the stages make a return here with precious few changes, giving you a feeling of deja vu, despite that new roster. This is a small complaint, however. The game looks good, the animation is insane, and it's all virtually arcade perfect. You have to remember that this is 1998, just a few years removed from arcade fighting translations typically being neutered on home consoles. To have this game look and run as great as it does was an exciting time, and one of the reasons why the 32-bit generation was so endearing. I adore the visual presentation in this, and consider it among the Saturn's best two-dimensional graphics. Fortunately, the music sees a complete overhaul. There are a bunch of completely new tracks here, and they are as solid and as fitting as anything in X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Q-Sound makes its return to complete the package. Here are a few examples for your listening pleasure. At the time of its release, Marvel's Superheroes vs. Street Fighter received incredibly positive reviews. Magazines from all over the globe fawned over its graphics, sound, and gameplay, labeling the Saturn version nothing less than a must-play winner. Even when someone went hard on it and complained about some things, the review was still overwhelmingly positive. But should it command that type of respect in 2025? The answer is yes. It's true Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter does reuse a number of assets from the previous game in the series, and I would have loved to have seen some of those changed more. Specifically, the backgrounds could have been changed to new locations, to make the game feel more unique and disconnected from the original X-Men vs. Street Fighter experience. My love of fighting games doesn't rest on the stages I fight on, however, so that's fairly easy to overlook. I also wish that Capcom had addressed the presence of mirror matches in the arcade mode. I hated this about X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and it's back again. This happens when the AI picks a character you have already chosen. It breaks the immersion a bit and is something that could have been easily remedied by adding the secret fighters in for variety. It's a small irritation, but one I have nonetheless. The real fun of this game was seeing the new roster of Marvel superheroes step into the world of the Capcom vs. Fighting series. This game is faster and so much more fun than the previous game that featured these characters, the standalone Marvel superheroes. The super combos are better, the animation is better, and its intensity in particular is light years beyond that product. Capcom devotees that fell in love with X-Men vs. Street Fighter's broken combo system lament its loss here, and I can understand that to a degree, but this game's more grounded and less exploitative gameplay has merit in a universe that otherwise allows its fans to run roughshod. You certainly have many other fighters in this series to fall back on if you love knocking the competition into the air until they're dead. For me, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter is one of the few games of its ilk where I actually explored the roster to see how each fighter played, instead of only looking for the easiest life-zapping juggle. Heck, back then I actually got pretty good with characters I normally wouldn't touch, and that's saying something for a guy like me that rarely deviates from the likes of Sagat, Ryu, Ken, and Akuma. I was also thoroughly impressed with the character Norimaru. Don't let this scrawny nerd and his silly animations fool you. I've seen some players learn this dude inside out and become nasty with him. I guess what I'm saying is this: if you preferred X-Men vs. Street Fighter for its roster and gameplay and don't consider this game worth the effort, I understand. Change can be a tough thing to accept, and I myself am guilty of preferential judgment. But I feel Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter is still one hell of a good fighting game. None of the Versus series is balanced well, but this is probably as close as these games ever came to a real attempt at parity between the fighters. I really enjoyed the addition of the expanded Marvel roster, and it still had all the charm and excitement of X-Men vs. Street Fighter. The Saturn port is also rock solid, and the best conversion of this game ever seen on a home console. Of course, there are a number of other ways to play this game. There's the 32-bit PlayStation conversion that was released shortly after the Saturn game. Many people bag on this port as terrible, but the PlayStation did the best it could with no RAM expansion to fall back on. It's rough, but still playable. Arcade 1UP also released a cabinet back in 2020 that included the game along with several others. I'm not sure if that is still available today, however. In 2024, Capcom dropped it in the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection that is now available for the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, PC, Xbox One, and their modern equivalents. This version is a direct one-to-one emulation of the arcade game, so if you enjoyed it there, or you're new to the game, this might be the best option. For you Saturn fans, however, I cannot recommend this enough. Not only does it make use of that glorious 4MB RAM expansion cart you own, but it also benefits nicely from modern devices like the Saru to load even faster. It's a great companion to X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and well worth playing. I'm Sega X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.